I'm still a bit on a high, reflecting everything that we just heard from Rabbi Saul Berman, and I want to thank again Rabbi Winberg and Berman for sharing that Torah with us and helping us to understand the halachic, spiritual Torah root of so much of what Rabbi Dr. Heschel was involved in. And there's something which is amazing about understanding that his Torah has continued over the past 50 years, and God continues way beyond those 50 years as we think about the future, which we'll do in our panel later tonight. We have the opportunity now to meet his daughter, to spend time speaking with Professor Susannah Heschel, who is, of course, the chair of the Jewish Studies program and the Ellie Black Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. Susannah is joining us tonight from her living room, not far from Rabbi Winberg's living room in Newton, Massachusetts. Susannah, you can unmute yourself just while we're preparing to hear from you. And I remember not that living. I've been in your living room there too, but I remember sitting with you, paying a shiva call in your parents' living room soon after your mother Sylvia passed away in 2007. And a number of us YCT students, Rabbi Winberg, perhaps you were there as well, were paying a shiva call, joining together, making a minyan after your mom had passed away. And I was touched. I was touched by the beautiful concert piano that was in the house. And as I walked around the house, I snooped a little bit and noticed that all of the walls were covered with honorary degrees that had been given over the years, up until 1973, of course, to your father. From various institutions around the world. You, when we were planning this, I reached out to you, said, can we talk today? You said to me, sorry, I'm in Lublin right now. They're inaugurating a new center. You didn't tell me the Pope was going to be there too. Inaugurating a new center, studying my father's legacy. And so I want to start off tonight and ask you, who was your father to you? And who was your father that he became such a universal figure to so many people? Good evening, Professor Heschel.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Yonah Berman. I think Rabbi Saul Berman was a great honor, something that all of us will always treasure, hearing your words tonight. Thank you. I want to also thank Rabbi Avi Weiss, who's been my hero for forever. And I thank you and Rabbi Saul Berman. You organized the Shiva for my mother, and I'm always grateful. And that's why I donated some of my father's library to Chovevei Torah. And Rabbi Linzer, I thank you for all that you've done. I am especially very moved by the words of my rabbi, Rabbi Benjamin Samuels, who's also Rabbi Seth Winberg's rabbi. We both live here in Newton. That was very lovely. Thank you. And also what Martin Luther King III said, that was a big surprise, and it was wonderful. I just have to say that I'm very moved by the gratitude of people who knew my father, especially people in the civil rights movement, because that was in the 1960s. It was 60 years ago. And yet I find that civil rights leaders are still grateful. And that is a lesson for me, for all of us, about the importance of gratitude and the importance of what we do and what a difference it can make. When you ask me about my father, I'll tell you, I feel my father really was a Hasidic Rebbe. Rabbi Belkin once said to him, "You're the rabbi to the world." And in many ways he was, because people from around the world, Jews and non-Jews, came to him and asked him for advice and were inspired by him and his writings. And more than that, he was a Hasidic Rebbe in the way that, I had the great privilege when I was a child still to know some of the great Rebbes who came from Europe to America. My uncle, the Kapitchnitzer, and cousins, the Boyaner, the Novominsker, the Shatner. These were extraordinary human beings, unforgettable, with the kind of gentleness and kindness, the sensitivity of someone who devotes their whole life to praying more deeply, spends their whole life cultivating their inner life, My father was like that. These were Rebbes who were so empathic and kind and wanted to listen in a deep way to whatever people brought to them, their troubles. My father was like that, but he also had the joy of Hasidism, the celebration, because, my home, when something special happened, he knew how to celebrate. He was happy. He was never withdrawn. He was never moody. He was always very present and full of enthusiasm and excitement. So I say this about him as a person. I think that he also gave us perhaps the awareness that in a way, Hasidism is always latent within Judaism. And there were moments when it began to flourish and something happened. But finally, he said, the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, brought heaven down to earth. And he felt that way deeply. I agree with him. There's something so profound in my father's understanding of what it is to be a human being and how possible it is for us to develop as human beings, to sense and realize that God is always with us, everywhere. I just say one last thing.
Go ahead.
There's a little phrase in Tehillim, in the Psalms. It says, "V'ani tefillah." Ani tefillah. And the commentaries say, well, it means I'm praying, or I'm a person of prayer, and so on. As usual, medieval commentaries get a little nervous, but there's something very moving about the idea that you can make your life into a prayer. And I think my father did. His life was a prayer. And I think he's telling us also that that's what it is to be a Jew, to be a religious person, to be a human being. We have that possibility to make our life a prayer. So that's what I think about when I think of my father, but there's so much more. But thank you, Rabbi Berman, for the opportunity.
There is, thank you. There is so much more. Something that I think about when I think about your father, there's a children's book that we have at home, which parallels the stories of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. with that of your father. Two individuals, I'm sure you've seen it, two individuals who encounter so much adversity earlier in their lives and who move throughout their lives not prevented, not stopped by what has happened to them until that point in their lives, but they embrace the challenges and they take upon themselves the opportunities to try to make the world a better place. Your father moving from Warsaw to the United States, losing so much of his family before the war, during the war. I wonder what the source of his optimism was. We didn't prepare this question when we talked before.
As an optimism, because, and he always used to say to me, you can't despair. Despair is a sin. Despair suggests that God is not present, and it's just, So his optimism came from his deep emunah, from his faith, without question. But, and he writes in his book on the prophets, for example, he says, evil is never the climax of history. I think what disturbed my father is not despair. I think he was shocked by indifference. And the reason he was shocked by indifference, in part, is also, it's Hasidic. A Hasidic Rebbe is someone who is always moved. And my father and Dr. King both used the same language in some speeches. They said, the God of the Bible is not the unmoved mover of Aristotle, who, sets things up and then steps back. But rather, God of the Bible is deeply moved by us and deeply affected by us. My father is talking about Sorach Gavoha, and he calls it in English divine pathos. that God is affected by human actions. And we know this from Kabbalah, of course. We say before we pray, before we make Kiddush, we say, L'shem yichud kuchabrichu shchinte. So my father expanded that. It's something that one of his students, Art Green, wrote about, that we can actually also bring that about, that unity within God, also in the way we treat other human beings, in the mitzvot ben adam l'chavero, and the way we treat other human beings. And so, when you think about what my father said when he returned from Selma, and he said, I felt my legs were praying. That's what he means, l'shem yichud, Vani tefillah becomes a prayer. And that's also so fundamentally Hasidic. What I do, how I do what I do, even in the most quotidian, mundane things of my life, to act with refinement and with the recognition that God is present in this moment. And I felt that about my father when we would go somewhere, go to the grocery store. Sometimes in New York City, the person at the cash register wasn't very happy, not in a good mood. But my father had such a nice way of talking to people. I think we all have a tendency, if someone is a little unfriendly to us, we respond in an unfriendly way. But my father transformed. He tried to make the person feel better. And that to me is also what a Rebbe does. It's Hasidic, it's Jewish, that idea. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, that idea that you can also transform things, transform someone's mood, to celebrate, to bring joy to somebody. And he was like that.
Can we speak about that a little bit in the context of Shabbat specifically? When you and I spoke last week, we spoke about recent issues of the New York Times that spoke about issues around Shabbat. We don't necessarily have to go back to that conversation specifically, although if you'd like to give your commentary on that, you're welcome to. But I really wonder, what was the Sabbath like? Not for Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, the writer, but Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, the father. What was Shabbos like in your house growing up?
Well, so first of all, I will just say that some of what's been written lately about Shabbat, I did see something in the New York Times. People like Shabbat dinner so much that even on Wednesday make. So of course, without a halachic framework, it's not Shabbat. And Shabbat is also about joy. They spoke too often recently about when you have to give up your computer, and the phone and so forth. But you're receiving. Shabbat comes to us. And I think that's what's so special. When I was a child, so my mother, of course, would go to the different stores in the neighborhood on the Upper West Side, would go with her. There was a kosher butcher store, and then the greengrocer for the vegetables, and the cake store for the challah, and then start cooking. And my mother would cook, and the house began to have wonderful smells, just like Jerusalem on a Friday afternoon. You walk through the streets and you smell Shabbat coming. And then my father came home early from his office, and he would get ready, and my mother. But what I loved is also just that feeling, the intensity of the day, how it becomes more intense as the day goes on, and suddenly it's time and everything has to stop. And we would kindle the lights in the dining room, and then we would go into the living room where the window faced the Hudson River, and we would watch as the sun set. And I think when we would just sit and talk, the three of us, and that was special. That was extraordinary. I think that we're talking about a gift that comes to us, Shabbat. I feel it's one of the greatest gifts that the world has received. that we've received from the Kadosh Baruch Hu as Jews, and we've given to the world. And yes, I was recently in Lublin, Poland, where there is a wonderful effort going on at the Catholic University of Lublin to foster better attitudes toward Jews and Judaism on every level, not just on the academic level, but everywhere. But in Lublin, there's a magnificent yeshiva building, but there was no Shabbat. There are no Jews. And I'd never experienced, I'd never been in such a place. And it was startling. And I just feel that the hope for the world in so many ways rests on Shabbat. We need Shabbat, and I'm sorry that Christians gave it up. It is a terrible loss. And I'm sorry for Jews who don't understand the joy. And in my home, Shabbat was full of joy and laughter and stories and a wonderful spirit, a wonderful atmosphere.
You mentioned Christianity. Your father had a special relationship. Of course, Dr. King was a minister, but his relationship with Christianity, with Christian clergy, goes beyond just that one very unique relationship. Can you speak a little more to that aspect of his work, of his rabbinate?
Yes. So actually, when my father was a student at the University of Berlin, which he entered in 1927, he wrote a doctoral dissertation about the prophets. And much of the dissertation is a very sharp critique of Protestant biblical scholarship and the failure to understand the Bible. He felt also that there were some Jews who also, the kind of critical attitude, couldn't appreciate the poetry, the inspiration. But after the war, my father didn't write anything like that again. Instead, he was grateful for the Christians who were helpful to him and understood his work and encouraged him, because a lot of people didn't in those days when he was writing The Sabbath. There were Jews who attacked that book, and it was painful for my father. He worried sometimes that maybe he was doing something wrong, because we all need affirmation. But yes, he had friends who were Christian theologians, and my father's hope at that point was trying to make Christians appreciate the holiness of Judaism. That's what was important. And yes, there were some who said that he shouldn't go to see the Pope in Rome. And my father said, if it will help to save one life, I will go. And yes, he had a wonderful friendship with Dr. King. But let me just say something else that I really would like to tell you. At the seminary in those days, the davening was an Orthodox synagogue, similar to my synagogue today, Shari Tefillah in Newton. And no one at the seminary would go to a conservative synagogue, even though they were teaching men, only men then, to become conservative rabbis. But it was also a service that was very, how shall I describe it? It was a little bit cold. It was not a place where they would ever end Shabbat morning davening with Shir Kavod, for example. So my father would like to go to the Ger Shtibel on the Upper West Side. That was where he went when he really wanted to daven. And I went with him too sometimes, my mother. And I just want you to know that after my father died, Rabbi Tziviak would come to our home on Friday afternoon every week for years and bring us challah and a bottle of wine for Shabbos. And I have to say, to me, it was like one of the stories about the Baal Shem Tov coming to the home of a widow. It was extraordinary and deeply moving to me. And I just say that because it's those kinds of gestures that mean so much, and tell us so much about the soul of Judaism.
Not just the soul of Judaism, but also that sense of reflection back that your father provided so much chesed, so much goodness to other people. And as you just pointed out, someone was able to bring that some of back to your home, to your family in the time of sorrow, and to bring that sense of love back into your home. We have a few minutes left. I would like to do something that we had not fully planned. Rabbi Saul Berman, if you could just wave and tell me that you're okay with me bringing you into the conversation for a minute. Thank you. I'm asking you to unmute if you can, please. And I'm going to ask the two of you, if you have anything to share with each other, any brachot. You know, we're going to move in the next portion to thinking about younger clergy and thinking about how they bring Rabbi Dr. Heschel's legacy to their students today. What is the Torah that matters today? What's the Torah that we want to bring to our students over the next 50 years? And I'll ask either of you, both of you, to comment if you'd like.
Well, I mean, one of the, I remember the first book of Dr. Heschel's that I read. I read when I was still in high school. I accidentally never heard of him, but I picked it up in the library, in a local library, and I brought it home. And on Shabbat afternoon, I lie down with the book, and I became entranced with it. I just sort of was there. It was a long Shabbat afternoon. I spent hours just reading it, and sort of felt as if I was going into a different sort of layer of reality. And so, that sensibility related to him, that there's a kind of spiritual power that his words have to actually transform the reality, has infused some of my own thinking about sort of the difference between spirituality and holiness. Because I believe that when we use the term spiritual, what we're really talking about is a state of awareness, whether it's the awareness of the presence of God, or the awareness of God's values, or the awareness of transcendence. I mean, what we call spiritual is that. Holiness goes beyond that. Spirituality is just a preparatory step to holiness. Holiness is the ability to actually bring God's values, God's virtues to life in the real world. And I think that's what Rabbi Heschel had the capacity to do. He wasn't only a master of words, he was the master of actions that had the capacity to transform the world in consonance with the very values and vision that he saw, that he experienced, that he lived, that he felt in his awareness of the presence of God in his life.
Susannah, anything to add?
Thank you, Rabbi Berman. That was wonderful. One of the last books that my father worked on is actually, there were two books, one in English, one in Yiddish. He wrote a book about the Kotzker Rebbe, and the importance of authenticity. That sometimes people would call my father, strangers would call on the phone and say, what should I do? I'm a Jew, but I don't know how to be observant. And he would tell them, start with Shabbat, kindle the lights. But he never imposed. He never said, you must do, this is what you must do, or, and in a way it stemmed from this, from the Kotzker. He quoted the Kotzker, your Judaism has to be authentic to who you are. You can't, Kotzker said, you can't be Jewish the way somebody else is Jewish. It's like wearing somebody else's pair of shoes. You have to know who you are. And my father did. He knew who he was. And he was, as a result, very understanding of other people. He was tremendously empathic. He was someone that I think everybody felt they could talk to in a deep way, and that he would listen in a deep way. That's what I mean about that. I see him as a Hasidic Rebbe in that sense too. But he had tremendous respect for individuals, for the individual. He did write an essay, it's in the collection called The Insecurity of Freedom, about the individual Jew, and how rabbis have sometimes neglected the individual, that we talk so much about the collective. I think people, everybody needs a Rebbe. Everybody needs someone to talk to, someone who will listen with empathy. I think if you ask about training rabbis, I would urge that, especially. And that's really what I miss so much. And my father said it also, by the way. He used to say how much he missed his father and how much he wished he could talk to his father again. And I miss my father very much. Also, just to talk about so many things. He had so much wisdom, and he spoke always with his heart. And you know what I mean, from the heart goes into the heart. And
Any other thoughts, final reflections before we move on to the next part of our program tonight?
So I find it wonderful that people are inspired by my father. I think it's great when people study his work and sometimes want to compare his writings to other people's writings or contextualize some of his writing in an academic way. That's fine. That's great. But that he brings inspiration to people, that's extraordinary. I'm grateful. I think he makes us be better Jews, better human beings, better Christians, whatever our faith is, he deepens it. He has a way of being able to make us realize also the joy of life. And I appreciate that too, because as Rabbi Berman said earlier, there's a lot of anger in our world today, a lot of resentment, and we fear it may lead to violence. And so I hope that my father's legacy is one that can soften hardened hearts, that can make us turn away from anger into joy, and that can make us realize how much the Bible has to offer us. As my father said, a psalm every day. Maybe we can have a psalm every day. So I thank you so much for this evening and for including me and for all that everyone has said tonight. I'm very grateful to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Berman, again, and thank you, Professor Susannah Heschel, again. In conclusion, I'll say that before we move on to the next part of our program, I'll share that I watched last night a number of videos on YouTube, Professor Heschel, of your father, and also was finally able to find one of your mother. And I'm thinking a lot about my mother as we, again, mark her yahrzeit soon as well. And it's actually a video that she helped conclude the program 25 years ago. The Jewish Theological Seminary had a program marking your father's 25th yahrzeit. They also had a program, by the way, marking his 50th yahrzeit a few nights ago. And we're grateful for the fact that there are many different groups that are marking his yahrzeit, that are remembering him and thinking about his legacy and how to continue that work. And your mother said something, I'm going to try to get it right now, but she basically said how much your father appreciated when people got him, when people understood something about his Torah. And, we talked a little bit about how he was a Hasidic Rebbe, and he was someone who really exemplified those qualities of being a Rebbe, something that I know that Rabbi Wimberg and I both appreciate about Rabbi Berman, with whom you were just speaking as well, Rabbi Berman Sr., as we call him in this context. And I'm thinking about the feeling of the fact that all of us have this need, this desire to get your father, to understand something, to feel connected to him. And while so many of us have not had the opportunity to meet him, we were not alive when he was alive, the reality is that for many of us, he's a Rebbe. And I want to thank you for channeling that Rebbe and for being a Rebbe for us as well, Susannah, in so many ways.